Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Narcotics News. In this episode, OB and Public Information Officer Mark Woodward and Judge Scott Rowland discuss House Bill 2176, the bill that puts pseudoephedrine behind pharmacy counters. They'll discuss why the bill was necessary, its passage, and its impact to celebrate the bill's 20th anniversary this April.
Well, I'm just going to say, during your time, it was the P2P labs. And you might talk just a little bit about it because we kind of went in phases. Obviously, there was P2P, and then Oklahoma already had carved some new ground, putting phenylacetic acid as a control, and other states followed. And then we kind of had that pause. But what was it like when you were with the Bureau in the P2P lab days?
When I first got there, which was in July of 1989, it was really just on the tail end of what I would say was a big spike in those P2P labs. But those were meth labs writ large.
Right.
I mean, they would make a pound of product, and you had to be something of a chemist. You had to have some basic chemistry knowledge. You had to have a triple neck flask. What was that? A reduction flask and a non-open flame heat source like a heating mantle.
Well, when we would see pictures of some of the agents took out at some of these grows or these labs where it's 55-gallon drums of chemicals. I mean,
it looked like
you weren't going to do it next door in an apartment complex.
No, it looked like a mad scientist operation, and you had to have this chemical of phenyl 2-propanone, which was essential for that method of cooking meth and almost unused in legitimate industry, so much so that there was a federal control put on it. And then there were a handful of exceptions to exempt. I remember perfume used it for one thing. And so it was very easy to control that drug and almost shut off domestic
that's
meth
exactly
production.
right. I mean, you look at the numbers from 89, 90, 91, 92, and 93, our lab numbers were 0. And then in 94, we had 10. And in 95, my first year, we had 34. And then it was 125, 241, 275. And within 5 years, we were well over 900 to 1,000 labs. But obviously the change was people didn't understand that, the labs we were dealing with in the 90s could everything you needed. You didn't need to go to some commercial, Thunderbird or some of these Mid-America Chemical. You went to Walmart. And most of us, I used to tell people when I would do teaching, that we all have a meth lab in our house. I mean, you've got cold pills, you've got matches, you've got starter fluid, you've probably got aluminum foil and camera batteries, coffee filters, and a bucket and some Pyrex cookware. You've got a meth lab if you just knew how to put it all together. And it was hard to get people to wrap their heads around when we talked about the new type of labs. And I think one of the big differences too, I think I'd heard P2P labs, if you were lucky, it was maybe 65%, whereas
the purity of the drug.
Right. Yeah. And then by taking Sudafed and pulling the oxygen out of it, it's 100% pure. So it was easy. Anybody could do it on your kitchen stove. You didn't need a college degree. You didn't need like the bikers used to hire a chemist out in the woods to do it. Now you're looking at a recipe that you got while you're in prison.
The smell of phenyl 2-propanone was so unique that someone who had been trained on that smell alone was probable cause to get a warrant.
Yeah. Like sour cat urine. Yeah. I mean, very, very distinctive.
I left OBN the first time at the end of 1994, and there were no meth labs.
Yep.
And I remember talking to colleagues a year and a half or 2 years later. And I said, man, I turned my back on you guys for 2 years, and you let the meth labs just soar off the charts.
My very first day on the job was it was a Saturday. So my first day was July 3rd. And hardly anybody was at the office. July 4th was the holiday Tuesday. So Wednesday, so my second day, but first official day on the job, I get there at the office about 7:30. At 8 a.m., we're doing a briefing in the conference room, and we're heading out to do a search warrant on a meth lab. I'll never forget it. I know the guy's name is Brandon Paul Owens, and his house was at 43rd and May Avenue. And we get to the house, you serve the warrant, kick in the door, and over in the corner of the living room is a triple neck flask and beaker, and it's sitting there bubbling away. The defendant's not in the house, so we called all the news channels, and brought them over because everybody in that house was like, this is what we'd heard about, but we hadn't seen one yet. This is the new meth lab. And it was a big deal at the time. We would bring people into the house. We would let I was live on the new news with Ron Gosden, I still remember his name, Channel 5, with the meth lab bubbling over our shoulder. Had no clue what we were dealing with. We're thinking, sure, come on in, let's see this. I mean, you think about that and how times have changed. Now you're wearing SCBA gear, and nobody even comes on the property that's not tied to the warrant. But it was such a unique thing to see that. And then we started seeing the fires. And then we started seeing, it started getting people's attention. And these weren't fires out in the woods from an old barn in a P2P lab. This was an apartment complex. These were cabins at our state parks and resorts. Things had really changed. And of course, that's when people contacted us and said, what are we going to do about it? And
I remember, though, and I came back to the Bureau in June of 96.
mm-hmm.
I was at the DA's office for a couple of years, and I came back and we were starting that wire unit.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time thinking that this is something of an anomaly.
Yeah.
Because in terms of the amount of drug that these things make, the contribution to the overall drug supply in Oklahoma isn't that great.
Yeah.
But the contribution, the diminution to public safety is maybe more than any other drug or any other drug trafficking organization.
Like nothing we'd ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And the other difference too, when they would cook out in the woods, you'd have one guy with a chemistry background cooking for, who knows, hundreds of bikers potentially. This is one guy typically cooking for himself, his wife, his brother-in-law, and a couple of buddies. Everything they cooked, they shot in their arm or smoked. They weren't getting rich. They were feeding they could feed their own addiction. You didn't have to go out in the dark streets and find your dealer.
It's because these were not economically driven crimes.
No.
They were addiction-driven crimes, but they were under the manufacturing category of offenses. Again, weird. In every other area of drug enforcement, if you have someone who's producing the drug, you usually don't have users hanging around. That's an entirely economically motivated crime. So it was odd.
And you can really speak to this. I remember having conversations. How do we convince a jury to put this guy in jail for 20 to life for manufacturing when he's got everything that you and I have at home in our garage and our medicine cabinets?
Interestingly, along about that time, the legislature lowered the minimum on manufacturing meth from 20 to life. And they split it into two categories and made one of them 7 to life.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember if we backed that or if we were in favor of it and just didn't oppose it. But at the time, I thought it was a godsend because you put all the evidence on of this drug lab and then tell the jury they've got to do 20 years or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any of them ever doing nothing.
Did you ever take a lab to a courtroom, put it in front of the jury and try to get them, okay, you got a milk carton, some road flares, you got some batteries, cold pills, and a crock pot. So can you send this guy to jail for 7 to life, please?
And these are jurors who are watching CSI on television, and the drug labs there have got these bubbling cauldron triple neck flasks and hoops of coiled wire. They look like a laboratory.
Yeah,
it was a problem.
Yeah.
It still wasn't something. And again, when I came back to the Bureau, I was assigned to a wiretap unit. We did wiretaps on local cell groups connected to Mexican drug cartels. And this drug lab problem was, to me, something that was going on, and I still couldn't figure out. It didn't fit into any of the neat categories. But this legislation happened because Lonnie Wright retired, essentially.
Right.
He was the chief agent over the intelligence division. Lonnie retired in late 2002, maybe September or something.
Yeah, went to work for the district attorney's council.
Yeah, he was retired for about 3 months, and he was an abysmal failure. He was miserable.
And we knew he would be.
In January, he went to work for the DA's council as their drug task force coordinator. And he immediately began to come back and tell us, he's going around to the different drug task forces around the state, trying to knit them together into some kind of cohesive unit to work multiple defendant complex conspiracy cases that interrupt the supply of drugs from farm to market.
Yep.
And these drug task force agents are telling him, good luck. All we do all day long is literally clean up these drug lab hazardous waste sites.
Well, and you had to. I mean, as much as we saw them as a nuisance, they were such a threat because when you've got people living next door and a grandmother saying, hey, I think they're cooking meth, that guy's house smells like he's painting the garage, and I know he ain't painting the garage. I mean, there were so many fires and explosions that you're going, as big of a nuisance as they are, we can't ignore them because innocent people next door are going to get hurt. And then we started seeing, I remember in 1998, it was our first phosphine and phosgene gas deaths. It was the Days Inn in Okmulgee. And we had 2 people die in a hotel room, and the maid got very sick. The sheriff, who didn't even enter the room, got very sick from an odor that you couldn't even smell was in the room.
I remember that.
And people are going, okay, now I don't even know if potentially deadly situations right next in the apartment next door is the hotel room. It was that, I think, woke a lot of people up when you got 2 dead bodies in a hotel room. And then you had, tragically, you started seeing the violence associated with it. And Rocky Eels was the first one to go down in 1999, shot and killed by Kenny Barrett when he and Buddy Hamilton were serving that warrant out in Sallisaw. It wasn't too much later that you had Trooper Matt Evans and then the Oklahoma City police officer killed going.
Rominger,
they crashed.
Jeff Rominger.
Yes, crashed on I-40 chasing a guy high on meth. And so we already had this. You got to do something about this. And we'd gone to the Capitol. Every year we ran 2 or 3 of our bills were to deal with the meth problem, but they always found solutions. That was a problem. We outlaw this, then they figured out we can make it with this. But
the problem was it wasn't like the old P2P labs where you had one linchpin chemical that you could control and shut off the illicit use and have very little effect on legitimate use. These chemicals all had multiple legitimate uses, and you were goring multiple oxes if you did anything to control it.
Well, and I think it was maybe you and Lonnie as the story I remember, I think you and Lonnie were in a car together driving somewhere, maybe on the turnpike, when
we went to
y'all talked about the interim study and look, if we don't control Sudafed, we're kind of wasting our time.
Claremore, Oklahoma. I had court up there, and he rode along, and we were talking about and again, it wasn't. It was everything you've described is true in terms of threats to public safety and all of that, but more to our attention at the time, it was monopolizing law enforcement resources.
Yes.
I mean, just to be blunt, there were a lot of highly skilled, highly trained drug investigators who weren't doing drug investigations.
They were garbage collectors.
Yeah, they were garbage collectors.
Yep.
These little ounce or ounce and a half mom and pop pickle jar labs that take 15 hours from start to finish to abate and do the investigation.
But you'd have jars in the kitchen. You got some out in the garage. We found some out in 2 sheds. You got to process all that, and then you got to call a truck, EMI, or there were 2 or 3 companies, but they were always like 5 hours away because they're at another lab, and you're in line. We would finish the lab at 11 in the morning, but those guys, the truck wouldn't get there till 11 o'clock at night, and our guys who were highly trained are sitting on the bed of their pickup truck eating a McDonald's hamburger, missing their kid's baseball game, waiting on a disposal truck. And of course, that's when Director Weaver, now Senator Weaver, he said, we can fix this, and we put together the lab containers so that, and then we put on at the Bureau training, let's teach these officers how to do it themselves, then they can put it in their truck safely, drive it over to one of OBN's containers, and then that truck comes once a month and empties those out. And that made a huge impact as well, but that was down the road. But yeah, these were so time consuming, so manpower intensive, and just a waste of a lot of talent and resources.
We were driving to Tulsa or back, or Claremore actually, talking about this, and had decided to try and get friends in the legislature to control pseudoephedrine. At first we're talking about making it a schedule,
right,
or a prescription drug. And Lonnie asked me. He said, what would be the first step? And I said, what we ought to do is call Representative John Nance and see if he will hold an interim study. We need a forum where we can make this case in an objective manner with evidence to people whose attention is focused on it. And we need to bring in all the partners that have a stake in this, from DAs to sheriffs to police chiefs and the feds, and let them tell this story. And that will give John Nance then, if he chooses to carry this legislation, a record to point to.
That's right.
And he said, well, how do we do that? We called John on back then, the cell phones. They weren't the
brick phone.
Yeah, they weren't like that, but it was still mounted in the car. And I remember the car we were driving. I remember dialing Nance's number on the speakerphone and telling him, and true John Nance, great statesman, great legislator, and former law enforcement himself. His basic reaction was, sure, I'll do it. What exactly are we doing?
Right.
and we put together that interim study.
Yeah, September. That was September of 03.
Was it? Okay.
And that becomes important later when we start talking about the next stage.
I knew that it was
September of 03.
It was a 2-day affair. I remember that. And various people came in and gave testimony about the problem and the solutions.
And we had all kinds of solutions, but they all kept coming around to, if we don't control Sudafed, folks, we've spent 2 days wasting our time.
I was looking for something in my office about 2 weeks ago, and I've still got a file that thick with all those documents from that interim study and all my notes and everything.
Well, and we did something else that was kind of smart. We before, because the session didn't start till February, we were able to get with all the stakeholders and say, look, here's what we're proposing. Are you willing to work with this? My uncle happened to be Phil Woodward, the head of the Pharmacy Association.
I remember him well.
We knew one of the biggest hurdles is going to be, you mean the pharmacists are going to have to write down, they're going to have to pull all this stuff from their shelves, they're going to have to deal with angry customers. But my uncle went to his association, and everybody around the state, he said it was like 98% in favor, said, look, this is going to be inconvenient, but compared to the fires and and the multiple deaths, and including law enforcement, and they were all like, it's worth it. And number two, we had to go convince the public, because like you said, we didn't want to necessarily make it a controlled drug where people are not going to have to pay copays every time they get a runny nose. The fact that Oklahoma had the ability to make it a 5, which says you don't have to go to the doctor. You're not going to have to pay a copay. You're simply going to have to show an ID at a pharmacy. You can't buy your Sudafed at Bob's gas station anymore. Because we pulled the numbers, and you remember some of those numbers that we got that showed how much gas stations in Fayro, Oklahoma, people can't even find Fayro on the map, but they were making more money selling Sudafed than gas, beer, and cigarettes combined.
I remember a slide that showed some of the even more traditional
ridiculous numbers.
Numbers of pseudoephedrine compared to soft drinks, Coca-Cola products, things like that. It was that really told the story. When you saw when you saw the economic end of it, where all the money was going, there's no question. People don't have that much of a runny nose.
Yeah.
Our people were not, I forget exactly what it was, 40, 50, 60 times more.
Exactly.
And the question is, are our people 40, 50, 60 times sicker than those in Arkansas and Texas? The answer is no.
Yeah.
They're making meth.
The other issue we had was, and you can talk a little bit more to it, the second thing that kind of got lost was that interim study also allowed judges to deny bond for somebody if they believed that they were a threat. And the reason was because these guys would cook. We would arrest them. They would get bond, and within days, a sheriff or somebody or even OBN would be back in that house again with another lab.
I was always proud of that aspect of that bill. It was insider baseball. People who weren't lawyers, who didn't go to court, who really didn't see the beauty of that. But what it did, it allowed a judge to, because again, this was an odd breed of crime. This is somebody who's a manufacturer and a user.
Yep.
And it allowed the judge, if they found that they were addicted, if they were a meth addict, they allowed them to make findings that they're going to go back and start cooking again, because that's what meth addicts do.
Yeah, and that's what becomes important about December 26th, because that's when Nick Green is killed by Ricky Malone.
Before that, I think it was in early December. I remember Lonnie and I met with the editorial board of the Daily Oklahoman and the Tulsa World. I remember it was cold, and we went to Tulsa and met with their editorial board. And we didn't get a negative reaction. We got kind of a puzzled reaction. I got the impression they were wondering, why are you guys here talking to us about these cold pills? We don't really get it. And you act like you expect us to oppose you. Well, we did. We expected them to oppose us when they heard from all of the special interest groups once they found out what we were wanting to do.
And we're the capital of allergy sufferers, and we need our Sudafed, and we all do, and that's the thing.
And then later in December, you had that tragedy. December
26th, Ricky Malone killed Nick Green on the side of the highway down in Duval, and 5 days earlier he had been arrested on his 6th meth lab, and he bonded out. Bond. And so that's why and this is important for two reasons. One, if we'd had that law already in place, there's a good chance, we'll never know for sure, there's a good chance that he's not out that Sunday morning, as Nick Green was about to go to church. But one of the neighbors delivering the morning paper said there's a guy, it looks like he's broken down the dirt road from your house. So,
not to be too graphic, but in the name of understanding what the climate was like back then, when we say he killed Trooper Nicky Green, what we mean is he executed him in full view of a dash camera that captured the entire thing while this trooper begged for his life. That was the nature of the killing.
That was absolutely what it was.
And this guy, who had been
paramedic,
EMT
firefighter,
had gone from being a firefighter, essentially on our side when I was in law enforcement, to executing a state trooper in the early morning hours the day after Christmas for what? To protect his meth lab?
Right. And you hear in that video, you can hear Nick start to pray, and that's when he's shot. And then you see Ricky Malone come back into the camera and start throwing some more stuff out into the field. Then he leaves, and you hear that second shot, and you knew that was it.
And that's the climate against which we were supposed to care that it was going to be inconvenient if you had to get your pseudoephedrine from a pharmacist.
And that also became important because, we filed the legislation. We had two incredible authors, Paul Roan, who's a former trooper, and in the Senate, we had Dick Wilkerson, who's a former OSBI investigator. And they're also chairs of the, of powerful committees up there. And they started having those hearings. And of course, that's when the drug company showed up. And I'll never forget when we had our first hearing, actually brought a meth lab up to the Capitol and kind of took it out of a bucket and put it on the table and showed it. And I remember the room was just packed with people. And on the other side of the room, though, was a lady from CHIPA, the Consumer Healthcare Products Association.
Consumer Healthcare Products Association.
Flew her all the way in from D.C. to fight this. But what she didn't realize is 3 people on this side of the room was Linda Green, Nick Green's widow, Matt Evans' widow, and Rocky Eels' widow. And so when you've got 3 dead troopers and a whole lot of destruction, and their only argument is, this is going to cost money.
There was an arrogance to them, though.
Yeah.
I remember them essentially telling us the problem isn't as bad as you think, and this won't solve it, and it doesn't matter because we're not going to let it happen anyway.
I'll never
forget. That was essentially their message to us.
It was.
That's why I think Lonnie was offended by CHIPA's people coming in here.
Yeah.
I don't know if I was offended, but I was greatly aggravated that they would dare make a moral equivalency.
Right.
And again, they wouldn't even go so far as to say it's going to cost us, our company's money. It was, this is going to be so inconvenient to our customers.
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
You don't talk to us like we're idiots. Every one of these companies, I remember Johnson & Johnson was one of them.
Yeah.
Was Bayer, Aspirin. It was all the big companies that make over-the-counter pharmaceuticals.
Pfizer was one of the biggest.
Kicking in money for this lobbying organization.
Yeah. They spent a lot of money sending a lot of people around the country to fight that as long as they could. They hated what was happening in Oklahoma.
I'll bet you
they wanted some document that would show that our numbers were not as good as they were, and they couldn't produce it. In fact, our numbers just kept dropping and dropping and dropping.
I'll bet you that organization had never stepped foot on Oklahoma soil before that happened.
No.
And they purported to tell us what we really needed to be doing.
Yeah, and that was another group that was very helpful. The Petroleum Association, we were able to get with them, and they pulled us the data of how much gas are your stations selling, how much Coke, how much cigarettes and beer. Now let's see your Sudafed. These selling these mini thins and Max Alerts, these unopened cases in the middle of the night is what they were doing out of these stores. And they were here's the Coke, cigarettes, beer, Sudafed, and that's just one store in Newcastle, Oklahoma, and you could do that all over the state. It was so they had millions of dollars at stake, absolutely, and that's just Oklahoma. Think of Missouri, Kansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the states throughout the Midwest that were seeing this. Indiana, I mean,
and
we
those
were
numbers, and their sales numbers had shot up over the last few years at that point. So it wasn't. They were certainly on notice that not only were their sales off the chart, but their sales were off the chart because the majority of it was illicit.
I think John Nance asked him in that committee, can you show us a chart that shows that head colds have increased at that same rate? And the room laughed.
Of course not.
Yeah. Here's head colds. Here's Sudafed sales. Can you explain that? And they couldn't do it. I mean, John just embarrassed them, absolutely embarrassed them. I'll never forget when Nancy Bucar, I don't mind telling her name through this podcast because it's on the record from back then, she said, this is simply a knee-jerk reaction to a trooper's death. And again, keep in mind, this was basically crafted in September. Nick Green didn't die till December. So it just put a face with a problem we said was already existing. For her to say that, and she did not yet realize there were 3 widows of 3 troopers in the room when she made that comment.
Well, she was from the Beltway in Washington, D.C., too. She wasn't living out in the heartland where these meth labs were literally ripping apart families and destroying law enforcement resources.
Yeah. So we will never be able to thank the legislature enough for how quickly they acted. I mean, that bill sailed through in about as quick as a bill could go through, and we passed it, and Governor Brad Henry signed it on April 6th. Now, the proof was in the pudding. Is this going to work? Because a lot of people said they're just going to find something else. They're going to go to the soft gels. They're going to go to liquid, all the things we exempted, remember? Because they were like, why are you exempting those? We're like, until we find a meth lab that's successfully cooked with a liquid or a soft gel, we'll deal with those later.
The experts were telling us at the time that it's exponentially less likely that they'll ever rise to the level of use of the soft gels. Do you remember there was also, and this may have been apocryphal, I never actually saw any evidence of it, but there was this mythical molecular lock.
Yes.
They were working on some technology, and they were going to be able to lock at a molecular level.
You couldn't pull the oxygen off,
Pseudoephedrine to the oxygen, and it couldn't happen. And probably in an effort to tell us just to back off, wait a while, and this is going to magically go away. And to this date, I've never heard
still waiting on that molecular
Never
lock.
heard more about it.
Yeah, because if we could have done that, we could have put it on oxycodone and hydrocodone, every other pill that they crush up and inject in their arm. But anyway.
Which, by the way, when they were first released, were not supposed to be subject to abuse because they had some sort of a time-release lock.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And we know how that movie ended.
But yeah, the proof was 30 days later, because we had a simple way of tracking meth labs. If your department found a meth lab, you either called OSBI, or you were Oklahoma City Police, who called their own lab, and Tulsa Police called their own lab. Either way, so every month we put those three agencies together. We knew exactly how many labs, because nobody else was working labs. You couldn't. And so we called those three, and by the end of April, our numbers had dropped 65%. By August, they were down 95%, and states were calling us left and right,
I remember
saying,
the graph chart.
"Can you right?
Look at that."
And can you send us a copy of it?" And what I thought was amusing is, and you'll probably remember this. At one point, Oregon was trying to pass our law, and Chippa was up there at their meeting trying to stop it, and they said, "Look, what's happening in Oklahoma." You know, there's a lot of things. You're hearing bad numbers. It's really not dropped. It's still a major problem up there in Oklahoma. The chairman of the Oregon subcommittee said, "Well, I believe we have somebody from Oklahoma here that can testify."
I do remember.
And now Deputy Director Brian Serber stood up and basically put them in their place. And Brian Serber was able to explain to that committee, here's what it is. And he passed out documents that showed exactly what's going on in
He
Oklahoma.
said, here's what the truth is.
It's exactly right. Here's what's really the truth of Oklahoma. It has absolutely been a silver bullet, because they can't make it with anything else. And if we do start seeing those, we'll deal with those. You fast forward 20 years today, we're celebrating the anniversary. There's still nothing. We've even had a few that have gone back to the old P2P labs and made an inferior product because they couldn't get Sudafed. And you know, of course, we put limits on it, and that made a difference, because we did have that time in the mid 2008 2009 where we were seeing these one pots where they would get small amounts and put it in a pop bottle, and they could make little bit amounts, and we had some issues there, and so we put in some new controls on some of that as well. But for the most part, it became. And you might talk about this too, when Scott Burns came and you and Lonnie met with him, the deputy drug czar, and then it became part of President Bush's Patriot Act and combat meth.
Yeah, he was from the National, let's see, was it?
ONDCP, yeah.
Office of National Drug Control Policy. And ultimately, the director of ONDCP came out and recognized the Bureau and gave an award to us for that. Yeah, Scott Burns, good guy. I think I had some stereotype of people from D.C. Who would do the right thing only if it was, politically expedient and absolutely no risk of any sort. And he wasn't that way. He was former local or state law enforcement, as I recall.
Yeah, he kind of had a ground level perspective.
He was a realist, and he listened to what we said.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, I mean, not to sound flippant, I didn't care if they did it or not.
Right.
I didn't care if any other state did it. It was working here, and it was all.
If we sent them all to Arkansas or Missouri, fine.
Yeah, I mean, that was
not our problem.
At the risk of sounding callous, but there was a time where we were running all over the place, meeting with state officials, testifying before the Kansas legislature,
Iowa,
Oregon, Illinois, Oregon.
I flew up to Missouri and spoke to theirs, and that was an interesting deal. They don't vote in committee. They hear all the bills, then you leave the room, and then a couple of weeks later, the committee behind closed doors decides which bills they would approve and didn't, and they did not approve Missouri's. Missouri still, I think, to this day, I don't think the state has it. I think individual counties had pseudoephedrine laws, but they were the last state. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on planes and trains and automobiles going around the country trying to get the truth out about what was happening in Oklahoma, because I don't think people believed it. It was too good to be true.
And of course, by that time, Lonnie Wright had become the director. Between the time that Lonnie was telling me about his experience of the drug task forces, that was January through June of 2003.
Right.
And then Lonnie was hired in June or July, probably took office 1 September, I'm going to say.
Yep.
So by that time and into 2004, Lonnie was now the director. He testified in front of Congress about this legislation. Senator Chuck Grassley, as I recall, was key in carrying it.
Yes,
I believe. It's been 20 years ago.
It became part of the Combat Meth Act and the Patriot Act. And I remember at one point the drug companies wanted to create some more exemptions, I think, like the 2-packs or things like that, and travel packs. And they wanted to put that in the president's bill. And it's my understanding they were like, well, we're not sure this is a good idea. What should we do? And I think the president asked John Walters, the drug czar, who talked to Scott Burns, who said, let's call Lonnie.
That's a fact.
Lonnie said, you do that, and they're just going to start buying the 2-packs. So it got back to the president, and
that is a fact.
They called Oklahoma to get
Lonnie
our advice.
I was with Lonnie Wright when Scott Burns called him and said, the president has asked my boss to inquire about these things.
Yeah.
It was an odd time because it had such an immediate, dramatic impact.
Right.
I don't think I ever doubted that it would.
Right.
I mean, they had to have pseudoephedrine, but nonetheless, I still was a little bit bowled over by the results. Maybe there's a bit of a cynic in me all the time. I don't know.
Well, and I'd heard a lot of people, the criticism was, meth is still an epidemic. It's still our number one killer. And we're like, we never said this was going to stop meth. You missed the point. We said this is about domestic meth production where these houses are contaminated. They're catching fire. They're blowing up. You got drug-endangered children, that is programs that are a nightmare because they got more kids than they know what to do with.
Remember the children's toys that were testing
filthy.
Positive?
We couldn't let them have the
testing
toys
positive
back.
for meth.
They basically came out of the house and they had nothing with them. We wouldn't let them take anything because they would contaminate the foster or their grandparent. I mean, they didn't. This was never about stopping meth, but we can deal with a carload of meth from Mexico a lot easier than a house blowing up and taking 5 people out with them.
I remember after the bill got out of the House, it was going to the Senate. Senator Dick Wilkerson, who'd been a former deputy director at OSBI.
Yep.
I drove out to Shawnee on a Sunday afternoon and met with him at a Denny's right off of I-40. I had my daughter with me, and she was about 1.5 feet tall. She's in her last year of law school now, by the way. And took the legislation, went over it with him, who was explaining the various parts and answering his questions, getting him prepared to present it. We had stout, courageous sponsors of those bills. They did not back down. And after the principal authors, and there were a lot of co-authors and a lot of people whose name wasn't on that who were very supportive, once they realized the scope of the problem and what we believed would be the effectiveness of the solution, they didn't really care what the lobbyists from Washington, D.C. thought. As a matter of fact, I think it became a badge of honor to vote against them. Right. We just exploited that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was only a year and a half after that passed that we lost Agent Chalk Erickson, killed by a guy Leslie Vance driving all over Woodward high on meth. So I mean, it hit close to home with us too. We had already lost Bill Morgan or Bill Stewart back in '85 to a crazy biker guy high on meth. I mean, we knew it. Yeah. Long John Silver's parking lot. We knew what meth could do. So, and our legislators understood that. And guys like Dick Wilkerson, Paul Rowland, they were wearing the uniform back when those guys died. So, I mean, when Bill Stewart was killed and others. So, I mean, they didn't really care much about what D.C. had to say. It was just such a drain on Oklahoma as a whole. So. It's amazing. I still get to talk with, I've talked to Dick Wilkerson a few times, Paul Roan, John Nance. They're all still with us. Many, tragically, we lost Lonnie Wright, but many of those people are still with us, still remember it, and they're very proud of their role that they had in this. So.
You and I were with John Nance last summer, and I think that is the beacon of his legislative career. That's the thing he's proudest of, I think, is having carried that and propounded that legislation. Yeah, no,
it took a lot of courage, and he was not exactly a veteran up there at the time. I mean, he was. I can't remember if he was in his 4th year out of 12. But
I believe it was 4th.
He was not. I mean, it still took a lot of courage what he did, but. We had other leadership there in the House. The Speaker of the House supported it. I don't think, and in fact, we didn't have a single no vote. But we had the majority of the House and Senate signed on as co-authors because they felt that strongly about this bill.
Was there a no vote in the Senate, or was it an abstention? I remember a senator from Tulsa that I was mad at.
Oh,
so they must have done something.
It could have been. But
not that I was held a grudge or anything for 20 years.
Right. Well, I mean, there may have been a few no votes I could remember. There was probably some skepticism. Is this really going to work? But it didn't take long for people to get convinced that this made all the difference. Literally within 30 days, we had hard numbers. When you talk to Oklahoma City Police, Tulsa, and they're like, they started calling other departments. I remember they started calling Lonnie and asking, we need training because we're not seeing labs anymore. These were drug task force. They're like, now we're ready to go work. Conspiracy, we've got meth, and it's coming in from Mexico from a source in Dallas. How do we work these? And so we were able to go, okay, let's work on real narcotics
you
cases.
Have called.
Yeah,
this is what we've been waiting to
right.
do.
Put on schools and do real narcotics
drug
training.
investigation.
Yep. So they were able to focus on what they were out there for, and so. That made a huge impact, and yeah, it's good to see that several of those guys are still with us. But I think one of my favorite moments of all of this, when it kind of really hit, was, and it was probably 2012, 2013. I was mindless TV. I was watching some rerun, I think, of Law and Order SVU, and the way they caught the suspect was they went to the pharmacy and because he had signed to buy Sudafed, and they were talking about, because that's the law, he left a paper trail. And I wanted to say, that's our law. So when it makes a plot line of a TV show, it's a pretty neat deal. So
I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I've had as bad a seasonal allergies as anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, I had as much right to resent this as anybody. I don't. But it was 2 or 3 weeks ago when I went to buy Pseudoephedrine, the little 30 milligram tablets, and the pharmacy tech began to explain to me the law, why I had to sign for it first, and I was miserable. I just sat and listened to her tutorial, and when she showed me the sign, I signed for it. I thought to myself, this really isn't necessary. I could tell you a story, but I won't.
You got a couple hours, we could walk you through it. So, I mean, there's a lot more to this. We kind of hit the high points to it, but so many people had a role in making this happen, and took some courageous action, from the pharmacists and to some legislators who, the drug companies, they write big campaign checks, and I mean, there was some risks that they took, the legislators who fought the drug companies in order to say that, enough is enough. Yeah.
I just remember one of the major pharmacy chains refused to cooperate. Walgreens, do you remember?
Yeah.
And it turns out they're training their pharmacists that you don't have to comply with this law. They had some interpretation, and we contacted them, told them we're not going to stand for this, and they were recalcitrant. They were really kind of rude, and we got with the U.S. Attorney's Office here, filed what's called affirmative civil enforcement, an ACE. It's a civil action to abate, in essence, a public safety or law enforcement nuisance. And settled the case for, it was over $1 million, I believe.
I want to say it was like either 1.3 or 3.1 million.
I just remember in discovery, I requested and was able to get through discovery the actual PowerPoint slideshow that they were using, which said unequivocally, here's why you don't have to do what Oklahoma says you have to do, training their pharmacists here. And but boy, that angered me. I thought, you're gonna take advantage of the economic opportunities in Oklahoma and sell products to our citizens and not obey our laws.
Right.
What arrogance.
Yeah. Especially when you've got widows over here who, for the sake of money, they're trying to say how inconvenient and expensive this is, and we'll never know how many countless people who died from meth, died from whether they're enforcing the law or they've got addiction issues, the contamination, the health issues. I mean, so many people, and we know this was happening, that we didn't know, even when we realized the dangers of the contamination, they would air the house out, put a new coat of paint, and rent that house to somebody else. And I've talked to remediation experts who said the only way that they would sign off that a meth home was safe to re-inhabit is bulldoze the slab, bulldoze the house, and go 3 feet down, because you can't get it out of drywall, you can't get it out of metallic surfaces. And some homes are worse than others, depending on how long they've cooked in there and the extent of the contamination. But it can be expensive just to get the testing done around the house. And there, we at our height of our meth labs, I believe it's 2003, it was 1,300, over 1,300. How many do you think we found? Maybe 1 in 30, 1 in 40. I mean, that's like every load we get on the highway. How many cars do we miss?
It's impossible to know.
Yeah, we'll never know how many thousands of properties were out there that are contaminated. There's somebody living in there and getting sick, and they're blaming the pollen and the mold in the air. They don't realize it could be those organic and inorganic compounds up in the air vents, or the child's getting sick from crawling on that carpet. So I just remember how filthy those homes were, and
but there are doubtless X number of people alive now, and X times X number of people with better lives because that bill passed. It's impossible to know for sure.
We actually had a guy approach us at one point at some public event, and he said, I just wanted to thank you all, because when you put that in the pharmacies, I couldn't get pseudo anymore, and I was really mad at you for a while, and then I realized I stopped using, so I guess I ought to be thanking you instead of being angry. And he said, I got clean because of that, because I couldn't get Sudafed. They didn't want to leave a paper trail, at the pharmacy. So, I mean, there were several steps, but putting it in pharmacies, we had the paper log books, and then it evolved to the electronic log books when people started, they'd sign Daffy Duck and all kinds of goofy stuff. But we eventually, took it that next level to the electronic tracking, and then being able to put limits so that right there when you show your ID and they scan it, boom, it'll say you've already reached your daily or your monthly or your yearly limit. And so that further enhanced our ability to stop them. And that's really made a huge difference in those what they called smurfing, where 10 guys go to 10 stores and each one buys their limit. Well, you got quite a bit of Sudafed when 10 guys are buying enough of it. But when this shows these patterns through that electronic tracking, that was another part that again, to brag on Oklahoma, we've been on the cutting edge of so many of these things, from the phenylacetic acid and then the Sudafed and then the PMP and electronic tracking and other things that we've done. So I think that's why a lot of states look at us. I kind of use that as part of the argument when people say, y'all, don't consolidate. It's because when you've got a standalone 24/7 agency who understands this, and you're not in a big bureaucracy because we were sharing our law with states like Florida, and they said we could never pass this in our state because we would have to go through so many layers just within our state police before we could ever go to the Capitol. We wouldn't be able to spend days at the Capitol and argue this. And so they were looking at Oklahoma, and it was a lot easier just to copy and paste what we did. And I've always told people, Oklahoma's drug enforcement system, yes, we are the only standalone, but as a result, I think, we're the blueprint for so many, and have pioneered so many things that are now national programs because of that freedom that we've got. So that's my kind of anti-consolidation, and I will stand by that all day long, that when you got a standalone agency with our kind of expertise, you're going to get things done.
The 15 years that I worked at OBN, that was what I was always the proudest of, and I tried to do my best to let the public know, and I don't think the public ever really understood to the degree that I wanted, what a lean, mobile, extraordinarily effective agency they had there. These were commissioned, and the civilian non-commissioned, as a matter of fact, is probably more so. Mm-hmm. They didn't respond to 911 calls. They didn't have to patrol. Their only focus in life was to sit around and think, how are illegal and deadly drugs getting to the citizens of Oklahoma? Mm-hmm. And therefore, how do we interrupt that and how do we stop it? Right. And whenever you have that freedom, you have innovation bubble up. Like you said, you mentioned some of those, this wire intercept unit that the Bureau had, or probably still has. Yep. It was the feds, the FBI and DEA would come around and wanting us to work cases with them because, again, it was just a minimal bureaucracy. Yeah. I can remember debating whether or not to get a federal wiretap order or a state one on a particular case, talking to DEA or FBI, I don't remember. And I told them the problem you've got is you've got to go to Washington, D.C. to the Deputy Attorney General. Our Deputy Attorney General is sitting at the end of the hall there scowling. We just walk up there and present the case.
Exactly.
It's so much leaner.
Yep.
That's one of the things that I always loved about this law. And I think in the end the public understood. The newspaper editorials, slowly but surely, came around. Yep. And it was an example. Nobody on our side of this stood to gain anything except professionally. Yep. It didn't put a dime in any of our pocket. It didn't advance any of our careers. What it did was free us and others like us up to do the job that we'd been trained and hired to do. Yep. And there wasn't any illicit motive. There was no secret agendas. There was no nothing except having to tell the tragic story of these dead public servants and others who would be if you don't do this. And so I have always thought of it in my mind as an example of how government ought to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
20 years ago.
20 years.
We'd like to thank Judge Rowland and Mark Woodward for their participation and our audience for their interest. Thank you.